So let me start by asking you how successful you think the modern healthcare business is. It's a rhetorical question, obviously. It's highly successful because in terms of global economic productivity, it's in the top 5, along with defense, alcohol, recreational drugs, things like that. It's in good company. It's in the top 5. Let's look at another metric. How many people does it kill? It's in the top 3, along with defense and food. We kill a lot of our patients. Ask any honest doctor. In fact, Professor Belinda Starfelt published a paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association a few years ago where she identified iatrogenic illness caused by the effects of medical intervention, as the 6th leading cause of death in the United States. We're not far behind. Let's look at another metric. How good is modern medicine in protecting public health? From that perspective, it is a disaster. It has been a complete waste of time and money. And the reason is it has lost balance, and it has lost perspective, it has lost vision. It no longer knows really what's important. I did nearly a decade of medical studies, and during that time I studied nutrition for 2 hours. Most of my medical colleagues are no better. And while we've been developing new kinds of pharmaceuticals, very specific, very selective, very expensive, very toxic, our public health has gone into a severe decline. And you can measure that in many ways. You know that we're all becoming heavier. Many of you have seen this table before, but every time I show it to you, I'm going to add a few more categories that you don't know about before. So this is NIDDM, non-insulin dependent diabetes mellitus. And once you are diagnosed with diabetes, the whole aging process is accelerated. You lose about 5 to 8 years of life expectancy. It increases the aging of almost every biological or physiological system. Hypertension, more than half of all American adults now have diagnosed clinical hypertension. We're going in the same direction. We're not that far behind. It's a tribute to the terrible diet that they eat, as is this problem. So something about this environment which is making us all sicker is rotting our brains. So towards the end of our lives, our brains are not functioning as well as they should. It's so common now we think of it as normal. It is clearly, if you look at the historical record, nothing normal at all. And here's another clue. These are neurodevelopmental disorders. What these are telling you is something is wrong, increasingly wrong, with the brains of the very, very young. So if this environment, or whatever it is about our lifestyle that is damaging our brains at the ends of our lives and is preventing them from developing properly at the beginning of our lives, what is it doing to you, to people in what I shall laughably refer to as the prime of their lives? I'll show you a slide in a minute which should knock your socks off. I used to play rugby at school. Do you play rugby in Norway? No, it's too tough for you. But I played that game for maybe 15 or 16 years in Scotland, where, we have winters like you do. And in the winter, the snow on the field would be, maybe half a meter deep. So when you tackled someone, they would just disappear in the snow. And underneath the snow, the ground was like concrete. And in all the time that I played, I don't really remember. I remember one person breaking a bone, and that was a foul. It was a deliberate attack. And now when I watch my friends' children play rugby on a weekend, every weekend the St. John's ambulances are there because we expect to see children being taken off the field with fractured fingers and wrists and clavicles and ribs. It's becoming very, very common. Your skeletons are not as robust as they used to be. And here's another little new piece of information. We're seeing much, much more osteoarthritis as well, not just osteoporosis. The entire connective tissue, the system of connective tissue, your articular tissue, all of it is weaker. It's less functional than it used to be. So knee and hip replacement has increased by, that hip replacement has doubled, knee replacement has increased 3 times in the last 20 years. And that's partly because we're all getting heavier, but it's also partly because our metabolisms are become so toxic that they're no longer capable of sustaining healthy articular tissue in the hips, the knees, and in other joints as well. Asthma, and these are allergies as well, have increased. They're just increased beyond all recognition. We think it's normal now for 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 children to go to school with an inhaler. When I was at medical school, we didn't see that. Those kinds of conditions were actually quite rare. The 20th century pharmaceutical model has been a complete and unmitigated disaster. Now, I warned you, but having shown you the increasing amount of neurodegenerative disease in old age and increasing neurodevelopmental disorders in the young, that I would alarm you with some statistics showing you what's happening to you. This is a meta-analysis carried out at the universities of Hartford, Ulster, and Brussels, and it's a study of studies looking at intelligence and how it has been measured over the last 50 years. In fact, you can go back a century because this type of study was done, the first one was done in 1895 in Britain, and it's a way of measuring intelligence that doesn't use IQ tests as you know it. It's more mechanistic, simpler, but it's actually very reliable and it correlates very highly with IQ measured in other kinds of ways. But it doesn't depend on education or how good you are with recognizing names, for example. And what this study shows is that since 1950, our ability to actually recognize a visual stimulus, to understand what it means, and then make a corresponding motor action, it sounds very simple, but it's measuring how good you are at taking information in, understanding it, and translating that into an action. Our ability to do that has slowed considerably, just in the last 2 generations. And the way in which it has slowed is the equivalent of losing 15 IQ points. We have all become much more stupid. And it's not because of your mobiles and your computer games, and it's not because of the ridiculous way that the media works these days. It's because this general intoxication, this general metabolic deterioration that shows itself in liver disease, bone disease, kidney disease, brain disease, is poisoning us throughout our lives. It's preventing us from approaching anywhere near our full potential. It's cheating you. It's cheating you of IQ points, of health, and of life. So this mess that you think is normal, you think it's normal to know someone or to have someone in your family who has heart disease or cancer or arthritis. You think that's normal? It isn't. That is the new normal. But it didn't used to be that way. And it has become insidiously worse so slowly that we didn't really notice it. And most of our doctors didn't really notice it either. They're too busy running around trying to put out fires everywhere they go. They don't take the time to step back and look at the historical perspective. And if they did, I think that they would change the way in which they practiced medicine. Does it matter? Does any of this matter? Because we are actually confronting a more existential dilemma, and that is, quite possibly, the end of our species. So this is data taken from Hadassah Brown University and the Icahn School of Public Health looking at sperm counts. Now, you may have heard that there are more problems with female infertility than we have ever seen before. That's true, but we're now starting to see the same problems emerging in males. And you can see here that since 1970, and this is again, it's a study of studies, this is based on many, many different trials that have been done in different parts of the world, male sperm counts have fallen by almost 2/3. And what we see are increasing numbers of men who are either subfertile or completely infertile. I mean, I could go on. There's just so much evidence that you are being gradually and chronically poisoned. But let me, while I'm on the subject of sperm counts, talk about testosterone. There is very good data from the University of Oslo, from right here, looking at the way in which testosterone concentrations have changed over time. Your fathers and your grandfathers, I'm speaking to the men in the audience now, had 30% more testosterone than you do. You're not as masculine as your ancestors were. Have any women in the audience noticed this? If we continue like this, our ability to survive as a species is actually now coming into doubt. Within 20 or 25 years, according to these trends, we will no longer be able to sustain our current populations at all. Whether you think that's a good or a bad thing is irrelevant. I'm not talking about planned societal reduction, but absolutely unplanned, chaotic, and therefore disastrous. Is there a single politician that you can think of, let's say in Norway, that has the brain and the backbone to be able to deal with issues like this? I don't see one, unfortunately. If any of you know one, please introduce them to me. So I would say don't expect the answers to these problems to come from the medical profession, because they're simply not taught about these types of issues, and do not expect your politicians to come to your help, because they won't. They're too busy with their hands in the till mostly. What we need to do is take care of our own health. And one of the first places to start is with the essential fatty acids. And they're essential because they have molecular structures which make them essential. They are a large part of the cell membrane. This is a cartoon of a cell membrane. And they have endocrine or hormonal functions which affect almost every physiological system in the body. Now, these are called phosphatidyl phospholipids. Name doesn't matter. What does matter is these little tails here. Each one of these molecules has got two tails, and those are fatty acids. And they can be saturated fatty acids, or omega-3s, or omega-6s, or they can be certain other things. And it's the ratio of the fatty acids in the cell membranes that determines how effective that membrane is at being flexible, at allowing metabolites to pass through and to be processed and be excreted. But it's also important in determining what hormones are made. And if they have too many omega-6s, which are from plant oils, and not enough omega-3s, which are basically from seafoods, these are broken down by an enzyme called phospholipase A2, and then you have various other enzymes, into hormones which are fundamentally pro-inflammatory. They drive chronic inflammation. And when you have chronic inflammation, they start to break down these fibers here, which are called the extracellular matrix, and they are what hold all your cells together. So if you have too much chronic inflammation, the matrix, this three-dimensional mesh of microfibers that holds your cells together in the correct orientation, allowing them to talk to each other and to function in an integrated way as a tissue and an organ, that matrix starts to fail, and cartilage starts to get thinner. You get osteoarthritis. Or osteoid in bone starts to erode, and you start to develop osteoporosis. Or, in fact, aging, for most of us, is like a process of fraying. We fray like cheap fabrics. We were not designed to do that. The only reason we do that is because of this chronic poisoning that I told you about, caused by our lifestyle, which causes chronic inflammation. And that's bad news and good news. The bad news is it's universal, and it's driving all these problems, and the medical industry knows nothing about what to do with it. The good news is these are slow processes. There are tools that you can use to intervene, and these tools are basically foods. They're very safe, and these are tools you can self-administer. You don't need me. You don't need doctors or hospitals or clinics. You actually don't. You can do a lot of this for yourself. So here you've got the key fatty acids, the omega-6s from plant oils, which turn into pro-inflammatory mediators. For any clinical scientist present, I apologize. That is an oversimplification, but they're mostly pro-inflammatory. The omega-3s are mostly producing anti-inflammatory mediators, which is why we give them names like resolvins and protectins and maressins, which comes, of course, from Latin, from the sea. And you'll see here that they're all metabolized by the same groups of enzymes. There and there. So if you're eating a diet which is full of omega-6s and not very much omega-3s, the 6s come down here and they flood all these enzymes, leaving very little enzyme activity over for the omega-3s. So if your omega-3s are derived from plant oils, and some of them are, you can't use them very well. You should not be eating too much omega-6s. That's bad news. Unfortunately, you are. This is, again, a study of studies looking at omega-6 levels in the adipose tissue of Americans. Why Americans? Well, that's where the studies were done. And you can see between 1960 and 2010, levels of omega-6s in their body fat increased almost 3 times. And that means levels of omega-6 in their cell membranes were increasing too. We can put that down to Mr. McDonald, Ronald McDonald, the President of the United States. No, sorry. That's a different Donald. So, this is the Happy Meal. I don't know how they can call it a Happy Meal. It's ridiculous. And And I'm not just against McDonald's, it's also Burger King and Pizza Hut and all of the other fast food joints. All the food that they produce is full of omega-6s, and here's why. You have a situation now where the agricultural sector is really dominated and owned, including genetically, by a small number of companies. So our production base, the terrestrial crops, are now dominated by two pillars, soy and corn, and they produce omega-6s. Now, these are turned into animal food, and in the cathode system, they're force-fed into the animals that end up on our dinner plates. It's not good for them, and it's certainly not good for us, because by the time we eat pork or beef or chickens or eggs or dairy or cheese or milk, it's also full of omega-6s. And then, just to make matters worse, we add plant oils with more omega-6s, so we end up with far too much omega-6. Both linoleic acid and the HUFA, which is arachidonic acid. Now, linoleic acid we don't think it's that bad for you. In fact, in some ways, it might be quite good for you. But arachidonic acid is not something that you want to have too much of. And the more of the linoleic acid you pour into the system, the more arachidonic you will make. The more arachidonic acid there will be, and the more pro-inflammatory mediators, and therefore more chronic inflammation. Looked at over the historical perspective, as long as we can see back in time, we have different techniques to do that. It looks as if 6 and 3 intake was pretty close, maybe 2 to 1, and then round about 1900, you can see it starts to change. 3s start to decline because seafood becomes a lot more expensive. And omega-6s start to take off because industry, around about the turn of the century, develops techniques to filter and sterilize plant oils and stabilize them. So they now have a long shelf life, and the food industry starts pouring them into processed foods because they're cheap and palatable. So rates increase from about 2 to 1 to 5 to 1 to 15 to 1 on average in Europe, and we have the biggest database in the world, over 250,000 samples of plasma, not plasma lipids, but cell membrane lipid profiles. So when anyone else in the world wants to study this, they come to talk to us. And this is done with VITAS, which is an accredited laboratory that works with the World Health Organization. And in the United States, it's now an average of 25 to 1. Now, if the 6 to 3 ratio is important, you would expect Americans to be much sicker than we are. And they are. They're exceptional. They have the highest 6 to 3 ratios. 70% of Americans are on one prescription drug. And 1 in 5 of them are taking 5 prescription drugs or more. That's Mayo Clinic data. It's the best data that I could find. The Americans are heavily medicated. And I'm not even talking about the recreational drugs that they take. These are pharmaceutical products. They are very, very pharmaceutically dependent. They're 5% of the global population, yet they are consuming more than half of all the painkillers, all the prescription painkillers on the planet, 80%, and they're equally highly dependent on antidepressants. Average height of the American is dropping. They're getting wider around the middle. More very clear signs of chronic intoxication. Their diet is killing them. People I know got very interested in this. This is the work of Joe Hibble, an ex-Marine who became one of the finest scientists working in omega-3s. And he was interested because he knew many of his colleagues who died as a result of the Vietnam War. Not during the fighting, but after the war was over. They died of suicide. More Americans died of suicide than died of enemy action. And Americans were also extremely vulnerable to PTSD and homicides as well, all indicative of loss of impulse control. If you don't have enough omega-3s in your brain can't function properly. So what Joe did, he had this idea that this could be a problem, and he managed to get hold of the brains of quite a large number of American vets who had killed themselves, and he analyzed them and found they had extremely low levels of omega-3s in their brain, thanks to the shoddy food that was being provided them by companies like Halliburton, who fed the US troops. Now, Joe's work was suppressed because the Army felt that it wouldn't help recruitment. I mean, after all, the idea that join the Army become depressed and kill yourself is not a good recruiting slogan. But Joe persisted, and eventually this was published, and this was part of the research that he did in the lineup to it, and he was looking at fish consumption versus depression, and the more fish you eat, the less depressed you get. More omega-3s means less chronic inflammation, means you have a better chance of living a longer, healthier life, a better chance of living out your health expectancy and your life expectancy. Something we call the inflammasome. And you can think of it as a kind of a system with two compartments, an upper compartment and a lower compartment. And in the upper compartment, what's important is the omega-6s and omega-3s. And if you have too much omega-6s, it produces pro-inflammatory mediators, which cause some minor issues. You have edema, the accumulation of fluid. Various immune cells start to migrate to the affected area, but you haven't really started tissue damage yet. That happens in the second phase. If you have this process of edema and various other things that are happening inside the cell, this leads to the rupture of lysosomes. Now, lysosomes are actually excreted by the cell as vesicles. They then break down, and they release a group of enzymes called matrix metalloproteases. And these matrix metalloproteases are what destroys the extracellular matrix and starts the process of the fraying, the deterioration of tissue, no matter what tissue that is occurring in. And here, what is important is not the omega-6s and omega-3s, but that's where the polyphenols come in. Because the polyphenols, which we obtain from fruits, some vegetables and spices, have the ability to block these enzymes. That's a classic enzyme inhibitory mechanism. But they also downregulate the genes that express for those enzymes. So the polyphenols reduce the levels and the activity of those enzymes. And that's important because if you don't have these enzymes, you don't break that down, that's what it really looks like. That's what the extracellular matrix really looks like. It's this very, very fine three-dimensional mesh of microfibers that holds all of your tissues together. Now, the matrix metalloproteases destroy that matrix. They eat up all those fibers. And although matrix metalloprotease may not sound familiar to you, you have heard of them because these are the same enzymes that are released by the flesh-eating bacteria. So you're getting the message now that all you need to do to stop chronic inflammation and stop or stabilize chronic degenerative disease are two compounds, omega-3s and polyphenols. And if that's the message you're getting, you're almost correct. That is a very, very large part of it. 6s, 3s, let's get that ratio right, which you can do with omega-3s, and let's add the polyphenols. And at that point, what I see in my practice is I see medical miracles occurring on a daily basis. In fact, they're not even miracles anymore. It's very obvious from where I stand that chronic degenerative disease is not like squeezing toothpaste out of a tube. It's not like rust forming on the underside of your car or a cut apple browning. It's not a simple process like that. It's simply a process where your body is no longer able to heal and regenerate itself, where it has been starved of what it needs, where the external damaging forces have been amplified. And to get that right is very simple. Stop the chronic inflammation. Reverse the malnutrition. Under those conditions, the body is extremely good at mending and healing itself. The problem is, we're not eating enough omega-3s, and our intake of polyphenols has also declined. This is based on studies that I published in the JRSM a few years back, looking at how much polyphenols we used to eat, even within the last 4 generations. And you can tell that our intake of polyphenols has been reduced by 90%. So the inflammasome, both the top chamber and the lower chamber, both chambers are running hot. The 3s have been taken out, the polyphenols have been taken out. That's why chronic inflammation is now so common. That is why degenerative disease has become so important to us. And that is why the medical system has failed so completely. Because the medical system doesn't have any drugs that they can use to stop chronic inflammation safely. They have anti-inflammatory drugs, but they're too damn dangerous to use in a protective way. The nutrients are completely safe. You can take them every day. In fact, you do. You just don't take enough of them. All you have to do is to find a way of increasing your intakes of these micronutrients, and at that point, you step outside of this appalling picture of public health that I was trying to paint to you earlier. One of the ways of doing that is by going back to heirloom varieties of fruits and vegetables. This is what carrots used to look like. That's what tomatoes used to look like. Find it out yourself. Grow the heirloom varieties. They're much more fibrous, much more darkly pigmented. They contain higher levels of many anti-inflammatory compounds, including polyphenols, and they're far less sweet. We've bred for size and sweetness because that's what consumers want, and we've lost much of the good stuff. That's what potatoes used to look like. And that looks like a beautiful still life from the Dutch golden period of painting, but in fact it's a very artfully constructed photograph of apples and pears and various other fruits. And these fruits aren't like the fruits you see today. They're not like this kind of rubbish. We have bred for volume and for sugar because that's what people like, and plants only have so much energy to them from the sun, and if they're being forced to breed for size, for volume, for weight, and for sugar, they don't have as much energy left to produce the anti-inflammatory polyphenols that we need. At the same time, you have malnutrition or dysnutrition, which means that your body doesn't have all the cofactors and catalysts it needs to rebuild healthy new tissue. I just want to make the point that although that might sound depressing, in fact, the news is extremely positive. These are very slow processes. There is a lot of redundancy in most human tissue. It's built in that way. We're engineered that way because of evolution. You have time. So these processes are taking place. If you're eating a typical Western diet, this is definitely happening, but you can change that, and you can change that by getting your nutrition right. You have to get out of this food environment. That's a food environment that causes chronic inflammation for reasons that we actually understand very, very well. Processed food is most definitely going to kill you. And in the meantime, you may have some ideas as to whether you have symptoms or not. The only way we can tell are through physiological symptoms like this. If you have raised diastolic blood pressure, varicose veins, hemorrhoids, accelerated skin aging, you have chronic inflammation. I mean, almost all of you have it anyway, unless you're already taking really advanced nutrition. You can take fish oil. Fish oil doesn't work. The reason is fish oil is not just omega-3s. You never find long-chain omega-3s in nature without compounds called fluorotannins, which are made by the same organisms that make the omega-3s. And it's the omega-3s and the fluorotannins that travel together through the food chain in the same way when you take a combination of those things, they travel throughout your body, arriving in the peripheral tissues where they are needed. This was all published in 2015 with a very good Hungarian doctor called Szabolcs László. We published this, and this became a very, very heavily cited paper. In fact, it was downloaded at such a rate that for a brief period of my life, I think 4 months, I was in the top 5% of the most read scientists in the world. Not just in life science. My friends, fame is fleeting, and that's not why I was doing this work. I want to try to make public health better, because when I see a system that's broken and that doesn't work, and that steals so much and gives you so little, I just want to put something better in its place. And this is where we start. We start with omega-3s and polyphenols that puts out the fires of chronic inflammation in a way that I've never seen before, and in a way that pure omega-3s on their own cannot do. Once you've done that, then products like Extend, which is a very broad spectrum micronutrient and phytonutrient support program, will give your body what it needs to heal. When you put those two things in place, medical miracles do happen. I've seen hundreds of them by now. I've seen many, many hundreds of patients who've been on pharmaceutical products for decades become drug-free as their conditions normalize. Now, I'm speaking medical heresy at this point. But I'm not saying anything to you that I haven't said to my own colleagues at Oxford and defended to them. And I can tell you, as a result, many of them are now on our team. The science is there. These are some of the most powerful tools that I've ever become aware of in half a century of medical research. And they're so safe that you can take them home. You can use them for yourselves. And if you want to improve your health, the health of your friends, your families, your communities, this is where you start. Thank you.